The loan officer's name was Aldrich Fenn, and he had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Delia Hargrove had been watching that smile for the past 4 minutes, ever since she'd laid her 3 documents on the desk in front of him, the deed, the will, and the business plan she'd written by lamplight the night before. Fenn flipped through them the way a man flips through a mail-order catalog when he already knows he won't buy anything. 30 seconds, maybe less. Then he set them down and looked at her over the rim of his glasses with that smile still in place, patient and hollow as a carved pumpkin. "Miss Hargrove," his voice carried the particular softness of a man who believed he was being kind. "You're 19 years old. You have no credit history, no collateral, no livestock, no working infrastructure, and you're asking this bank to lend you $200 on the basis of a property that has sat idle for 7 years. He paused, glancing at something on his desk that she couldn't read upside down. "The barn burned in 1876. The coop is partially collapsed. There is no secondary structure of any kind. The soil classification on the eastern parcel shows erosion damage going back at least a decade." Another pause. "I'll be direct with you because I think that's the respectful thing to do. Sell the land. 43 acres in Licking County properly marketed will bring you somewhere between $800 and $1,000. That is real money. That is a start." Delia had prepared for the number. She had not prepared for the way it would feel to hear her grandfather's land described as a liability by a man who had never once stood on it. Her hands were folded in her lap under the edge of the desk, and she kept them there still. "I appreciate your time." She gathered the 3 documents, aligned them against the desk's edge, and slid them back into the leather folder Henrik had kept in the top drawer of his desk for as long as she could remember. The folder smelled like him cedar lanolin, the faint ghost of pipe tobacco he'd given up in 1871. She stood before Fenn had time to offer anything else. Outside, the air along Main Street in Newark was cold and smelled like mud. March in Ohio does not commit to spring. It makes suggestions and withdraws them. Delia untied her horse from the post in front of the bank and stood there for a moment with one hand on the gelding's neck, not looking at anything in particular, just feeling the solid warmth of the animal under her palm. She drove the 9 miles back to Dry Creek Road at a pace the horse set himself. The road was soft from snowmelt, the ruts deep, and the gelding, a bay named Porter that Henrik had bought in 1877, picked his footing without being asked. Delia had never named the horse herself. He'd arrived already named, already knowing his job, the same way most things on the Hargrove place had arrived, settled into their roles before she was old enough to question them. The property came into view from the top of the last rise, the way it always did, the house first, its white paint gray in the overcast light, the north corner of the foundation visibly lower than the south, a tilt so familiar she'd stopped noticing it years ago. Then the yard, the well, the collapsed coop, with one wall leaning against the other like a man too tired to stand straight. Then the fields, 43 acres of what had been pasture and cropland and orchard, now all gone to tall grass and thistle, and the particular silence of land that hasn't been worked in 7 years. No barn. The barn had burned on a Tuesday in August of 1876, lightning strike on a dry summer, and Henrik had never rebuilt it. At the time, Delia had been 12 and had understood it the way children understand financial disaster as a fact with no explanation attached. She put Porter in the small lean-to shed behind the house, forked him hay from the dwindling stack in the corner, and stood in the shed doorway looking at the back of the property while he ate. The hill rose behind the house, not dramatic, not the kind of hill anyone would bother naming, just the natural swell of limestone country in central Ohio, covered in dead grass, some cedar scrub along the upper ridge, the old stone wall running horizontal across its face like a seam. Her great-grandfather Ezra had built that wall. The stone had come from the upper field, Henrik had told her that once when she was small, when she'd asked why the field was so clear and the hills so rocky. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of her. She read the business plan she'd written the night before. It was 4 pages in her own handwriting, divided into sections: livestock selection feed, cost projected, revenue timeline. She read it the way you read something you've already decided to do, regardless of what anyone says. Then she closed the folder, drank her coffee, and looked out the window at the hill. Henrik Hargrove had died on the 14th of January, 1883. He had been 71 years old, had farmed this land for his entire adult life, and had never, as far as Delia knew, seriously entertained selling it. Not when the barn burned, not when the yields dropped in the dry years of the late 1870s, not when her father had gone to Columbus in 1879 and stopped writing after the first year, not when it was just the two of them, an old man and his granddaughter, maintaining a property that was worth considerably less than the effort required to maintain it. The county tax assessor had visited in 1880 and told Henrik with bureaucratic gentleness that the land's assessed value had declined for the 3rd consecutive year. Henrik had thanked him and offered him a glass of water. Delia had been living alone on the property since January, occupying the same house where she'd grown up, eating from the kitchen garden and the root cellar, and the occasional generosity of the feed store in town that let her carry a small credit. She was not destitute. She was tight. Those were different things, though. The distance between them could close quickly. Her mother had died in the summer of 1877 from fever, the same outbreak that took 3 other families on the east side of the county. Delia had been 13. Henrik had not made the loss into a lesson or a story or a moral. He had simply continued working, and she had continued working alongside him, and the grief had settled into the land the way grief does when there is no time to sit with it, distributed, invisible, permanent. The second day after returning from the bank, Delia began her survey. She pulled on Henrik's old work coat, took the spool of twine from the supply shelf in the shed, and walked the full perimeter of the property before noon. She was systematic. She had a notebook, a new one she'd bought in town, with the last of her pocket money, and she used it the way Henrik had taught her to use such things, not for feelings, not for plans, for facts. Soil condition at each quadrant, fence post integrity numbered from the road, standing water locations, tree health along the creek border, the depth and direction of erosion channels on the eastern parcel, the state of the well casing, the angle of the coop collapse, and whether the lumber was salvageable. She worked until the light went flat in the late afternoon, then sat on the old stone step at the back of the house and wrote her summary. The property was not what Aldrich Fenn had described. It was not hopeless. It was neglected, which was a problem of time rather than structure. The soil in the central pasture was still good. Henrik had rested it intentionally. In his last years, she now understood not abandonment, but a kind of fallow. The creek ran clean. The well was sound. The house foundation, whatever its aesthetic faults, was stable on 3 sides. The 4th side was its own problem, but manageable. She was still writing when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the dry road. The man who climbed down from the wagon was 58 years old, built like someone who had spent every one of those years doing physical work and had not considered stopping. His coat was good quality, his boots better. He moved with the ease of a man who owned 200 acres to the west and knew it. He crossed the yard toward the house without hesitating, as though he had walked this path before. He reached the back step where Delia sat and looked at her notebook and then at her. "You're Delia Hargrove." Not a question. His voice was even unhurried. "Silas Brandt. My land runs along your western fence line." He didn't offer his hand. He put his thumbs in his coat pockets and waited. The fact that he knew her name before she'd offered it arrived in her mind as a small, clean fact to be noted. She had not introduced herself. She had not been seen in town more than twice since Henrik's funeral, and on neither occasion had she spoken to anyone she didn't already know. "Mr. Brandt," she closed the notebook, "I know the fence line." "Then you know the western section needs attention. 3 posts down between the oak and the creek bend." He said it without accusation, the way a man states weather. "I've been meaning to say something for a while. Didn't want to bother your grandfather while he was ill." "I'll get to the fence." Brandt looked past her toward the empty fields, the absent barn, the hill rising behind the house. His gaze moved across the property with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are calculating rather than simply looking. "I'll come to my point," he said. "I'm prepared to offer you $800 for the property. Cash. I can have it drawn before the end of the week." He let that sit for a moment. "It's a fair price for the current condition. You're young. $800 is real money for a fresh start." $800. The same figure Fenn had named almost exactly. The coincidence had a shape to it. "I'm not selling." Brandt absorbed this without reaction. "It's a hard property to work alone. Most things are." He looked at her for a moment longer, the look of a man recalculating, not conceding, then nodded once, turned, and walked back to his wagon. He climbed up without hurrying, took the reins, and drove west along the road without looking back. Delia watched until the wagon rounded the curve at the tree line. Then she opened her notebook and wrote in the margin of her survey notes, "Knew my name." Didn't ask the acreage, didn't ask the soil condition, already knew the price. The third day was when she found the wall. She had been walking the stone boundary on the upper slope behind the house, following it east toward the property corner where the cedar scrub thickened into near forest. The wall was Henrik's father's work, Ezra Hargrove, who had built it in the 1850s from stone pulled out of the upper field when he'd cleared it for planting. Delia knew this the way she knew most things about the property, from overhearing, from context, from the single carved marking on a cornerstone near the house that read E.H. with a date she'd never been able to make out clearly. The wall was approximately 4 feet high along most of its length, dry stacked limestone, the kind of work that takes patience rather than skill, though it takes skill too. Along the lower section, it was familiar she'd played along it as a child, had sat on its top edge 100 times, eating apples from the old tree nearby. But as the wall climbed the slope toward the eastern edge of the hill, the character of the stone changed. The rocks became larger. The fitting became precise in a way that casual farm wall construction is not. Each stone was seated against its neighbor with the kind of attention that suggests someone was thinking not just about keeping the wall standing, but about keeping it standing for a very long time. Then she reached the gap. It was not a collapse. She understood that immediately, the way you understand the difference between a window and a hole in a wall. The stones on either side of the opening were finished, their edges squared, their faces flush. The gap was deliberate, arched slightly at the top by a single flat stone laid across the span. It was a doorway. The stones at its edges were worn smooth, a rounding at the corners that comes from 10,000 repetitions of the same contact, a sleeve brushing the same stone as a body passes through. Wild rose had grown up across the opening, decades of it, canes as thick as her finger, the kind of growth that takes a long time to establish. Delia pulled her coat cuffs over her hands and pushed through. The thorns caught anyway. She didn't stop. On the other side of the rose, a short passage between the wall and the hillside, no more than 4 feet deep, floored with the same packed earth as the surrounding slope. At the back of this passage, set directly into the face of the hill, was a door. She stood still for a moment and simply looked at it. The door was wooden plank construction, the boards vertical, their surfaces weathered past any color into a deep gray-brown that was almost the color of the stone around them. The frame was cut stone, the jambs fitted with the same precision as the wall outside. iron strap hinges, hand-forged, ran horizontally across the planks at 3 heights. The hardware was the kind made by a blacksmith who intended his work to outlast himself. The padlock was hanging open, not broken, not forced, hanging on the hasp with the shackle loose the way a lock looks when someone has removed it intentionally and set it back without engaging the mechanism. The rust on the lock body was uniform and old. The rust on the hasp where the shackle rested was the same. Nothing recent had disturbed it. Whatever hand had left this lock open had done so a very long time ago. Delia reached out and took the lock in her palm. It was heavier than she expected. She turned it over. No maker's mark she could read. She set it aside on the stone sill and put both hands on the door. It did not move. She pulled harder, shifting her weight back onto her heels, using her full body rather than just her arms. The door shuddered, scraping stone, then a gap 6 inches, then a foot, then it swung far enough that she could turn sideways and slip through. The air that came out was cold and dry, not cellar damp, not the soft rot smell of enclosed earth. Cold, like the deep side of a stone foundation in January, dry, like the inside of a flour barrel, carrying only the faint mineral suggestion of the limestone it had been resting against. She slipped through the gap. The darkness inside was total, the kind that sits on your eyes like a physical pressure. Delia stood still with her hands at her sides and let her breathing slow. She had not brought the lantern. She had not brought anything. She had come out this morning to survey fence posts. Her eyes found nothing because there was nothing to find, no window, no crack, no ambient source. She stood in complete dark, which is its own kind of information. No drip of water, no movement of air across her face, no sound except the faint protest of her own coat as she breathed. She became aware of the ceiling first, not by sight, but by a quality of the sound around her, an absence of echo, where echo should be, which meant mass above her at close range. Her right hand found the wall, stone dry, slightly rough with the texture of dressed limestone. She moved her palm along it and felt the coursing of the masonry, regular level, the work of someone who had used a line. She followed the wall to her right for approximately 12 feet before her hand crossed an iron ring, cold and solid, bolted through the stone with a backing plate she could feel on the face. She stopped, moved her hand further. Another ring. She counted by feel 6 rings evenly spaced along this section of wall. The floor was packed earth smooth under her boots, level. She took 3 careful steps forward, and her outstretched hand found vertical boards, a partition chest, height with a gap, and a swinging section at the near end, a gate opening inward. She pushed it. The leather hinge moved without sound. She was standing in a livestock stall. The dimensions she measured by feel and pace, approximately 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, solid partition on 3 sides. The gate she'd just pushed through on the 4th. The floor inside was the same packed earth with a slight depression in the center that rain barrel logic told her was deliberate drainage angled toward the back. She knelt and ran her hand across it. The channel was clean. She backed out of the stall and moved forward along the wall. Another stall, another, a 4th, all identical in construction, all dry, all with that faint mineral smell and nothing else, no rot, no ammonia, nothing to suggest the presence of animals in recent memory or the absence of care over time. She reached the back wall and found the second doorway, smaller than the entrance, and she would need to duck. Beyond it, a change in the quality of the dark, which is impossible to explain except as the way a room feels different from a corridor. She stood at the threshold. Ahead of her was more space larger, and from somewhere inside, it came a sound so faint she initially dismissed it as imagination. Water, moving water, very slow, very small but present. She didn't go through, not without light. She stood at the threshold for another full minute, listening to the dark, then turned and felt her way back to the entrance, squeezed through the gap, and stood in the March air on the hillside with the pale light coming through the cedar branches above her. Her heart was beating harder than the cold warranted. She stood there until her breathing steadied. Then she looked back at the door, gray wood iron hardware, the padlock sitting open on its hasp where she'd left it, and felt something clarify in her thinking, the way things clarify when you stop arguing with them. The property had been idle for 7 years. The barn had burned in 1876. The coop was half collapsed. The pastures were gone to thistle. Everyone who looked at this land, from Aldrich Fenn to Silas Brandt to the county tax assessor, saw the same inventory of absences. Nobody had looked at the hill. She walked back down to the house, went directly to Henrik's desk in the front room, and opened the bottom drawer. She had been through this drawer twice since the funeral, once with the lawyer, once alone. Legal papers, the deed, the will, insurance certificates, tax receipts going back to 1862. She lifted the whole stack out and set it on the desk. Under the stack, at the very bottom of the drawer, was a piece of folded graph paper. It had been folded into eighths, the folds worn soft, with handling the paper, aged to the color of old cream. She unfolded it on the desk surface with the care she'd have used on something she suspected might be damaged, smoothing each crease flat with the side of her hand. It was a drawing, pencil precise, executed on the grid of the paper with the kind of drafting discipline that implies either training or temperament. The drawing showed a cross-section of the hill behind the house. She recognized the slope profile, immediately the angle of rise, the approximate position of the stone wall. Within that cross-section, rendered in careful lines, 3 rooms, the first large with rectangles along the walls that could only be stalls, the second broader with a symbol near the back wall that she'd seen on mechanical drawings. Henrik had kept a pump. The third room, irregular in shape, its walls following the natural contours of the limestone, connecting the room's passages, their dimensions noted in small numbers, angled lines emerging from the second and third rooms through the roof of the cross-section ventilation shafts. The drainage channels she'd felt under her feet in the first room were there on the paper, their slope angles specified. In the upper right corner of the drawing, in handwriting she did not recognize, not Henrik's cramped back slant, but something larger, more deliberate, each letter formed with care. Livestock shelter, built by E. Hargrove, 1858 to 1861. Stone from the upper field, 40 degrees year-round, built to last. E. Hargrove, Ezra Hargrove. Her great-grandfather, who had come to Licking County as a young man, built this farm from cleared land, raised Henrik here, died in 1871 at the age of 67, 14 years before Delia was born. She sat down in Henrik's chair and looked at the drawing for a long time without touching it. 3 years, 1858 to 1861. He had built it during the same years the country was splitting apart, when half the men in the county were enlisting or debating enlisting, when iron and lumber were expensive and getting more so. He had pulled stone from his own upper field, which explained why that field was so clear, and he had fitted it into the hill behind his house with a precision she had just run her hands over in the dark. She looked at the ventilation shafts on the drawing, 2 of them angled to emerge on opposite faces of the hill. She had not found them from outside because she hadn't known to look. She thought about the air in the first room, not stale, not depleted, moving without any detectable source. The angles of those shafts were specific, not vertical but oblique, cutting through the rock at a shallow pitch that would create passive convection. Hot air rising on one side, cool air drawn in from the other, no mechanism required beyond the physics of temperature differential. Ezra Hargrove had understood something about how stone and air behave together. He had applied that understanding over the course of 3 years with nothing but hand tools and time. Built to last. She folded the drawing back along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she put it in the leather folder with the deed and the will and the business plan that Aldrich Fenn had dismissed in 30 seconds. She spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for the next morning. She found the lantern in the shed, cleaned the chimney glass with a rag, checked the oil level, trimmed the wick. She took the measuring tape from the tool chest, a good brass-fitted cloth tape Henrik had kept coiled on its spool, its hook still sharp, and wound it onto the spool. She found the notebook she'd bought for the survey and saw she still had 30 pages unused. She sharpened 2 pencils. She filled her work canteen from the pump and set it on the kitchen table beside the lantern and the notebook and the tape. In the morning, she would go back to the hill with light. She woke before the sun and sat in the kitchen with coffee, looking at the items arranged on the table. Outside the window, the sky was still dark, the stars visible between clouds moving fast on a northwest wind. By the time she'd pulled on her coat and boots and walked the path to the stone wall, the horizon to the east carried the first gray suggestion of morning. The door was exactly as she'd left it, the padlock on its hasp. She lit the lantern before entering, holding it up and away from her face so the light reached as far as possible, then turned sideways and came through the gap. The room opened in front of her. The ceiling vaulted to 9 feet at the center, the curve of the arch precise, each course of stone slightly smaller than the one below it. The walls were dressed limestone, the same dry stack construction as the outer wall, but finished. The faces of the stones worked smooth, the joints tight. Along the left wall, the 6 iron rings she'd found by touch, spaced exactly 6 feet apart, each bolted through the stone with a backing plate. Along the right 4 stalls, their partitions built from heavy planks, the leather hinges still supple in the cool air. She stepped to the near stall and pressed one of the leather hinges between her fingers. It bent without cracking. Whatever it had been treated with oil tallow, something else had done its job across more than 20 years of disuse. The floor packed earth level, the drainage channel running from each stall to the back wall, where it disappeared through a gap at the base of the stone. She crouched and held the lantern near the gap. The air moved faintly against her cheek, out, not in. Passive drainage following gravity through the limestone bed to whatever outlet existed on the downhill side. She stood and measured. The main chamber was 40 feet deep, 16 feet wide. She wrote it down. The height at the walls was 7 feet at the crown 9. She sketched the floor plan on the graph paper. She thought to bring the same grid scale as Ezra's drawing so she could lay them side by side later and see where they agreed. They agreed precisely. The second doorway was at the back of the main chamber, centered its lintel, a single flat stone spanning the opening. She had to duck by 6 inches. On the other side, the second room, broader than the first 20 feet across the ceiling, rising to 10 feet at the crown. Along the back wall, wooden racks built into alcoves, cut directly into the limestone, their construction integrated with the rock rather than simply attached to it. Hay storage. The design kept the floor clear, allowed air circulation beneath the stored material, prevented ground moisture from wicking up through the wood. The pump was in the near corner of the second room, a hand pump over a basin cut from a single piece of limestone, the basin itself approximately 3 feet across and a foot deep. The pump mechanism was iron old and surface rusted, but mechanically intact. She worked the handle, stiff, resistant, then gradually loosening. 20 strokes, 30. The pipe gurgled, then water came brown with rust, for the first several seconds, then clearing, then running cold and clean and continuous as long as she kept the handle moving. She stopped pumping, cupped water in her palm, tasted it, cold, faintly mineral clean, a spring somewhere in the limestone below, the same aquifer that fed the well at the house, but accessed through a different channel, through the rock itself rather than the dug well shaft. She looked at the racks along the back wall. They could hold 2 seasons of hay above the floor, protected from moisture, accessible without moving the stored material below. The alcoves were cut at a height that made loading and unloading possible without lifting above shoulder level. Ezra Hargrove had thought about this. He had thought about the person who would use these racks, the work of their arms, the angle of their reach. The third doorway was smaller, set in the left wall of the second room near the back. She went through it into the third room, irregular, as the drawing had shown its walls following the natural geometry of the limestone rather than being cut to a plan. Larger than the second room in floor area, but lower the ceiling ranging from 7 feet at the entry to 8, where the rock arched naturally above a shallow depression in the floor. Along the walls, wooden shelving, simpler in construction than the racks in the second room, built for general storage. A second drainage channel crossed the floor and joined the first. She sat down on the packed earth floor of the third room with the lantern beside her and looked at the ceiling. The stone above her was solid. She pressed her palm to it. Dry, faintly cool, the texture of dressed limestone. She thought about the 3 years it had taken Ezra to build this, the hauling of stone from the upper field, the fitting of each course, the cutting of the air shafts and the drainage channels and the socket for the pump, the construction of the wooden elements. 3 years of evenings and Sundays, or 3 years of days while the farm ran itself, or some combination. She didn't know which. She knew only the result. She stayed in the third room long enough to complete her sketch, then retraced her steps through the second room and back into the main chamber. At the entrance, she turned and held the lantern up one more time, letting the light reach the far wall. 40 feet of dry, sound, ventilated space, clean water, storage above the floor, temperature she hadn't yet measured but could already feel cold enough to be stable, warm enough to sustain animals through the worst of an Ohio winter without supplemental heat. She thought of what Aldrich Fenn had said, "You have no barn." She thought of Silas Brandt's offer, $800, made by a man who already knew her name, who had not asked what the land was worth because he already knew that too. She squeezed back through the entrance and stood in the morning air on the hillside. The sun was fully up now, low and pale, the cedar branches around the entrance casting thin shadows across the stone wall. From where she stood looking downhill toward the house, you could not see the door. The tangle of wild rose and honeysuckle she'd pushed through had already fallen back into place across the opening, indifferent to the disturbance. She walked back down to the house and ate breakfast, standing at the kitchen counter. Then she sat at the table with Henrik's survey maps and Ezra's drawing and her own new sketches spread across the surface, and looked at all three at once. The hill held one main chamber large enough for 12 animals comfortably, perhaps 15 with sectioning. A second room that could store 2 full seasons of hay without reduction in usable floor space. A third room that could function as either additional livestock housing or equipment storage depending on the season. Clean water on demand, passive temperature regulation, ventilation without mechanical systems, drainage that worked with gravity, all of it built in 1858 to 1861, all of it standing unmodified in March of 1883. 22 years of disuse and nothing had moved. She looked at the corner of Ezra's drawing where he had written those 4 words, "Built to last." There was a sound from the road hooves on softening mud, unhurried. Delia looked up from the table. Through the front window, she watched Silas Brandt's wagon pass on the road, heading east toward town. He didn't stop. He didn't look toward the house. He drove past at the same unhurried pace he did everything, and the wagon disappeared beyond the tree line. She looked back at the drawing. He had offered $800 for this property, for this house that was sinking on one corner, for 43 acres of untended pasture, for an empty yard with no barn. $800 cash before the end of the week, offered by a man who already knew her name and had already calculated the asking price before he climbed down from his wagon. The question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since yesterday solidified into something with edges. He hadn't asked about the acreage. He hadn't asked about the soil condition. He hadn't asked about the well or the creek or the timber along the east border. He had looked at the hill. She remembered it now with the clarity that comes after the fact, that single moment in the conversation when his gaze had moved across the property and then for a fraction longer than the rest rested on the slope behind the house before moving on. She folded Ezra's drawing back along its 8 creases and put it in the inside pocket of her coat close to her body. Then she carried the lantern to the shed, cleaned it, capped it, and put it back on its shelf. She had a great deal of work to do. She started the list that afternoon, not because she needed to write it down to remember it, but because writing made the work real in a way that thinking did not. Henrik had taught her that not with words, but by example. Every project on the farm had begun with a list on paper. Every list had become an order or a task or a modification, and the paper trail of those lists was the actual history of the place, more honest than any deed. Materials first: fencing panels, wire gate hardware, water troughs, minimum 2, 1 for the main chamber and 1 for the second room, deep straw bedding over packed oak planks for the stall floors, straw, a full pallet and a second pallet of hay to supplement whatever she could store on Ezra's racks before the season change, a thermometer because she needed numbers, not impressions. Tools she mostly had. Henrik's collection was thorough. The man had never thrown away a useful tool, and his shed held the accumulated hardware of 40 years of farm work: post driver wire stretchers, bolt cutters, a good pry bar. She'd need new drill bits for the bolt work, and she'd need mortar material for the cracks she'd spotted in the third room's ceiling during her survey. Small cracks, but she intended to know about every crack in that ceiling before she put animals under it. She walked to the Hendricks and Sons farm supply the next morning rather than driving, because Porter needed the rest and because she wanted to think on the way. The road was 4 miles into town by the direct route, past 3 other properties before the outlying houses of Newark began. She walked it in an hour, arriving at the supply yard before the morning was fully warm. The man behind the counter was the younger Hendricks Thomas, who had taken over the business from his father 2 years prior. He was 34, methodical, the kind of person who remembered what you'd ordered last season without consulting his records. He looked up from his ledger when Delia came in. "Miss Hargrove," he set his pencil down, "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather. He was a good customer for many years." "He bought dray rope from you every autumn," Delia said. "Gate hardware in the spring. He said you kept the best stock of anybody in the county." Thomas Hendricks absorbed this with a nod. "He did say that. What can I help you with?" She read from her list. He wrote as she talked, asking clarifying questions about specifications, gauge of wire, dimensions of the fencing panels, size of the water troughs. When she finished, he looked at the total and then at her. "This is a significant order. I know what it is. Cash payment, or are you looking to carry an account?" The question was asked carefully, the way questions are asked when the answer matters, but the asker doesn't want to appear to assume. "I have $21 cash." She'd counted it that morning on the kitchen table, the sum total of what Henrik's estate had left liquid after the funeral costs. "I can pay that against the order and settle the remainder within 60 days. A pause. Hendricks looked at his ledger again, then back at her. "I'll need something against the balance. I have the property deed, 43 acres in fee simple, no mortgage." Another pause longer. "Your grandfather carried an account with us for nearly 30 years, Hendricks finally said. "He settled every balance by year's end. I'll extend the same terms to you." He tore the estimate from his ledger pad and folded it once. "Delivery on Monday. I'll send 2 men. She walked home with the folded paper in her coat pocket alongside Ezra's drawing. 4 miles back, the same way she'd come past the same 3 farms through the same thin spring sunlight. She was aware with each step of the gap between what she had agreed to pay and what she currently possessed. 60 days. She needed to be generating income before 60 days elapsed, or she would need to find income from somewhere else, and there was nowhere else. The delivery came Monday as promised. Two men on a flatbed wagon, both older than she'd expected, with the deliberate efficiency of people who have unloaded farm equipment their entire lives. They worked without commentary, stacking panels and troughs in the pattern she directed near the base of the hill, behind the house under the oak tree that served as a navigation landmark. When the wagon was empty, one of them straightened and looked at the pile, then at the hill. "You've got a place to put all this?" "I have a place." He looked at her for a moment longer, then strictly necessary, then at the hillside. Nothing in his expression changed. "Your grandfather was a quiet man," he said. "Good, but quiet." He climbed back up to the seat without asking anything else. She spent 3 days installing the panels. The work was harder than she'd planned for. The anchor points Ezra had drilled into the stone walls of the main chamber were positioned for a slightly different panel dimension than the modern stock she'd bought, close, but requiring adjustment. She shimmied, remeasured, unbolted, and moved brackets twice on the second stall before the alignment was right. Her hands bled on the third day from a combination of wire ends and bolt threads and the general attrition of working in close quarters with metal and stone. She wrapped them in cloth strips she cut from an old shirt and kept going. The work was also in a way she hadn't anticipated satisfying. There is a particular quality to fitting work to the task of making two things align that don't quite align, of adjusting until the measurement is right and the gate swings true on its hinge and the latch catches cleanly. It requires attention of a specific kind, patient and iterative, accepting of the gap between the first attempt and the final one. Henrik had been good at this kind of work. She hadn't known until she was 3 days into the installation that she was good at it too. By Wednesday evening, she had a working configuration of 8 stalls in the main chamber with a central walkway wide enough to move a wheelbarrow through. She'd run a secondary water line from the pump in the second room through the passage using iron pipe from Henrik's supply shelf that turned out to be exactly the right diameter for the pump outlet. She'd installed the water trough in the main chamber's northwest corner, where the floor's natural slope would direct overflow toward the existing drainage channel. She lit the lantern and walked the length of the chamber, checking each stall gate, each water connection, each section of fencing. Then she walked it again. It was ready. She went to the livestock auction in Newark the following Thursday. The spring sale ran from 8 in the morning until the light failed, a long parade of animals through a yard that smelled like straw and anxiety and the particular sharpness of animals that have been transported. Delia moved through it with her notebook, writing down prices as animals sold, building a picture of the current market before she committed to anything. Goats were selling well. The breed favored in the county was the Toggenburg, sturdy, good producers, tolerant of Ohio weather. She watched 3 lots sell before she found what she was looking for, a pair of Toggenburg does in good condition, 4 and 5 years old, already proven milkers, and a wether being sold as part of the same lot. The seller was a woman named Linda Marsh, 60-some years old, a long braid over one shoulder, hands that had done this work for decades. "Sound animals," Linda said without being asked, watching Delia study the 3 goats. "The older doe freshened last month. You'll have milk inside of 2 weeks if you manage it right." "Where are you keeping them?" Delia asked. Linda's expression shifted fractionally, an assessment quick and professional. "Small barn back of my property. But I'm reducing the herd. Husband's health." She said it matter-of-factly, without asking for sympathy. "You have a place for them." "I have a place." She paid $4.50 for all 3. The price was fair given the doe's milking history. She knew this because she'd spent an hour watching the morning sales. She loaded them into the borrowed crate in the wagon bed and drove home at a pace that would not stress them. The evening air had gone cold by the time she came up the slope toward the hill entrance. The 3 goats had been quiet on the journey, not the panicked silence of animals in distress, but the alert, evaluating quiet of animals paying attention. She unhitched the crate from the wagon and carried it to the hill entrance, then lifted each animal out individually. The older doe she'd named Clover in her head, before she'd even bought her the name, had arrived with the sight of the white marking on the animal's left shoulder. Clover stepped to the threshold of the entrance extended. Her neck drew in one long breath of the air coming from inside, then walked in as though she'd been doing this her whole life. She went directly to the water trough, drank, moved to the nearest stall, and lowered herself onto the deep straw bedding. The second doe, sable dark and watchful, paused longer at the entrance. She stood in the opening and looked into the lit space with the particular intentness of an animal that processes information through its nose. Then she walked to the center of the chamber, stopped and looked up at the vaulted ceiling. She made one sound, soft, questioning, a sound directed upward at the stone arch above her, and then she was quiet. The weather Jasper hesitated until both does were inside. Then he came through with the resigned efficiency of an animal that has decided the situation is acceptable, walked to the straw pile in the corner, turned twice, and lay down. Delia sat on an overturned bucket at the chamber entrance and watched them settle. The lantern burned steadily on its hook. The air smelled like stone and straw and the warm animal presence that had been absent from this space for as long as the lock had been hanging open on the door outside. She stayed until she was certain all three were calm. Then she walked back down to the house in the dark. She was in the kitchen making coffee the next morning when she heard a wagon on the road. Through the window, she watched Obadiah Cutter drive past on his way to somewhere east, then slow, then stop. He was 71 years old and had the deliberate movements of a man who had decided long ago that he would not be hurried by anyone or anything. He climbed down from his wagon and walked across the yard to the back of the house, where he stood looking at the empty pasture with his arms crossed. Cutter. She opened the back door. He looked at her, then at the pasture, then at her again. Heard you bought some goats off Linda Marsh yesterday. He said it the way people in this county said things, not as a question, not as an accusation, just as a fact presented for comment. 3 of them. Where are they? On the property. He looked at the empty pasture again, at the absent barn, at the empty yards on all sides of the house. You can't just loose goats, Miss Hargrove. Coyotes work that creek bottom every night. 3 goats loose in this country won't last a week. They're not loose. He waited for elaboration. She didn't provide any. He stood there for a moment longer, his face carrying the expression of a man confronted with information that doesn't fit his existing map, then shook his head once and turned back toward his wagon. Knew your grandfather 40 years, he said, not to her exactly, more to the air between them. He never did a thing I could predict either. He climbed up. All the same, it's a lot of work for a young woman alone. He drove on. By the time she'd walked to the hill to check on the 3 goats and returned, Marjorie Kern had stopped her wagon at the road and was calling across the yard. Word traveled in this county the way weather traveled, fast, low to the ground, hard to stop once it started moving. Delia crossed the yard and stood at the fence line. Silas Brandt said, "You've got goats but no barn," Marjorie said. "Mr. Brandt doesn't need to worry." Marjorie looked at the hill, at the house, at the yard, the same inventory of absences everyone seemed to take when they looked at this property. All the same, she said, echoing Cutter's phrase without knowing it, it's a harsh spring. She drove on. Delia stood at the fence until the wagon rounded the bend. She looked at the hill. From the road, from the yard, from every accessible angle, there was nothing to see. Grass, cedar scrub, the old stone wall, running across the lower slope, the wild rose and honeysuckle that had been growing over that section of wall for years. No indication of what lay behind and beneath it. She picked up her notebook from the kitchen table and walked back up to the hill. Inside, Clover was standing at the back of her stall, watching the entrance. Jasper was eating hay. Sable was exploring the perimeter of the main chamber with systematic interest, pressing her nose into each corner in sequence. All 3 were warm, dry, calm. Delia checked the water level, checked the bedding, checked the temperature on the thermometer she'd hung from one of the iron rings. 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 38 and dropping toward the night. In here, insulated by 30 feet of limestone in every direction, the temperature would not drop below 40, no matter what the weather did. She sat down on the upturned bucket and opened the notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date, March 21st, 1883, and under it, she began to write the first entry of what would become the logbook of the Hargrove Hill: feed consumed, water used, animal behavior, temperature morning and evening, any observation that differed from the day before. The lantern burned. Sable completed her circuit of the chamber and came to stand near Delia, close enough to be touched, regarding her with the sideways intelligence of goats. Outside, the sun was going down behind the ridge. Inside, the light held steady. Nobody knew these animals were here. Not yet. The week after she brought the goats in, Delia went back into the hill with a proper measuring kit and spent 3 days mapping every surface she hadn't already mapped. This was not sentiment. She had 3 animals in a structure she had not built, whose integrity she had not verified, whose history she understood only through a folded drawing and a cornerstone inscription. The fact that it had stood for 22 years of disuse was evidence, not proof. Evidence told you what had happened. Proof told you why it would keep happening. She started with the ceiling. The vaulted arch of the main chamber was her primary concern, the highest span, the most load above it, the most to lose if something was wrong. She worked section by section, pressing both palms flat against each course of stone, feeling for give, for powder, for the hollow resonance that signals a cavity behind the face. She found none. The stones were as dense against her hands as the day they'd been laid, each one bearing the weight of the courses above it with the indifferent solidity of limestone that has had a long time to settle into its position. The construction was dry stacked throughout, no mortar, which showed no lateral movement, no crumbling at the joints, no evidence of water infiltration at any point along the span. She recorded every section in the notebook: 42 linear feet of ceiling surface, checked by hand, noted by position. Then she went to the walls, then the floor, which she walked on her knees with the lantern close to the ground, looking for subsidence, for soft spots, for the slightly darker color that indicates buried moisture. Nothing. The second room took another full day. The racks along the back wall she tested by climbing them, putting her full weight on each shelf in sequence. The wood flexed slightly, old growth, still elastic, but didn't crack, didn't separate from the alcove walls, didn't shift at the joints where the timber met the cut stone. The alcoves themselves were integral to the rock, not added to it. Ezra had cut the receiving notches before he'd built the racks. The racks were seated in the stone the way bones seat in sockets. The pump she serviced as thoroughly as she could with the tools available. She disassembled the valve mechanism, cleaned the leather cup that formed the suction seal, reseated it with tallow from the kitchen, reassembled. The pump moved more smoothly afterward and required fewer strokes to bring water. She noted this in the logbook and wrote a follow-up task: source replacement leather cup before winter. On the third day, she went into the third room and stood in the center of it for a long time without writing anything. The third room was the one that had bothered her during the initial survey without her quite knowing why. The ceiling was lower here, following the natural contour of the limestone rather than a designed arch. The walls curved inward at 2 points where the bedrock had natural projections that Ezra had incorporated rather than removed. The room had the quality of a space that had been fitted around what was already there, rather than carved to a plan which was different from the first 2 rooms, which bore the marks of someone working with a clear picture in mind. She pressed her hand to the ceiling at the low point, 7 feet from the floor, the point of closest approach. The stone was cool, dry, rougher than the dressed surfaces in the main chamber. She moved her palm across it slowly. Then she stopped. There was a crack, not large, perhaps a quarter-inch at its widest point, running diagonally for approximately 18 inches before tapering back to nothing. She held the lantern directly against it and looked at the walls of the crack, old dust-filled, with no fresh edges, no recent spalling. It had been there a long time, but cracks in ceiling stone above the third room's irregular floor plan were a different category of concern than cracks in the engineered arch of the main chamber. She measured the crack, sketched its position relative to the room's corners, noted its orientation. Then she walked the rest of the third room's ceiling with the same attention she'd given the main chamber. One more hairline crack shorter at the far wall. Same characteristics, old, stable, dry. She wrote in the logbook, third room ceiling, 2 cracks, noted, apparently stable, require monitoring. Do not use third room for primary livestock housing until expert review. Then she wrote below it, find someone who knows masonry and load-bearing stone, not for permission, for information. The next morning she walked to the county agricultural extension office. The woman at the desk told her there was a retired civil engineer named August Pruitt who sometimes consulted on old farm structures, barns, stone outbuildings, foundations. He was 68 years old, had spent 40 years building and assessing structures across Ohio, Knox County. Originally, he charged nothing except reimbursement for travel. She gave Delia a postal address. Delia wrote a letter that afternoon, 3 paragraphs precise. She described the structure's approximate age, the construction method, the materials, the dimensions. She described what she'd observed. She asked if he would be willing to visit and provide his assessment. She mailed it Thursday morning. While she waited for a reply, she expanded the livestock operation. The following Saturday, she drove to the poultry sale at the Whitfield Fairground, a smaller affair than the spring livestock auction, conducted from a series of wooden crates in the back half of a feed barn, presided over by 3 sellers who all seemed to know each other and regarded outside buyers with the cautious assessment of people whose stock is worth something. She bought 18 hens, a mix of Plymouth Rocks and Dominiques, both breeds she knew from Henrik's time, both suited to the mild, constant temperature she was establishing in the second room of the hill. She also bought 3 ducks from a boy who was selling them from a grain sack and seemed embarrassed by them, as though he'd only brought them as an afterthought. The ducks were Rouen, heavy-bodied, good layers. She paid $1.20 total for all 3. She brought the goats in first, confirmed all 3 had settled through the night without disturbance, then introduced the birds to the second room the following morning. Moving 18 hens from crates to the second room required 3 trips and the active cooperation of no one, which was fine because she had no one to cooperate with. The hens objected to transport on principle, but accepted the second room with remarkable speed. Within an hour of the last crate being opened, they had spread themselves across the floor in the particular formation of chickens that have decided a space is acceptable. 2 of them had already found the gap at the back of Ezra's lowest storage rack and claimed it as a preferred roosting location. The ducks were more philosophical. They walked in single file into the second room, examined the water basin near the pump with professional interest, decided it was insufficient for their purposes, but would do, and settled into the corner nearest the drainage channel. Delia stood in the doorway between the first room and the second and looked at what she now had: 3 goats in the main chamber, 18 hens, 3 ducks in the second room, 24 animals. The second room was warmer than the first, by 2 degrees. She recorded this possibly because the birds added metabolic heat to a smaller space with slightly lower ventilation. She went back to the logbook. Feed consumed day over day, water usage, egg production. The hens had not yet started laying in the new environment, which was expected. Birds take several days to adjust to relocation before resuming production. She wrote this down. She would know in a week whether the adjustment was normal or whether something in the environment was wrong. Pruitt's reply came Tuesday. He would come Friday. He asked her to have measurements available if possible. He would bring his own instruments, but having her data would save time. He would need access to the full structure. He noted that based on her description, the construction sounded consistent with mid-century Ohio limestone work, which he had seen examples of in his career, though rarely in this form. He signed it, a Pruitt retired. She had the measurements ready. She had them organized by room cross-reference to her sketches, with the crack locations noted separately on a dedicated page with dimension drawings. She had the original drawing from Ezra in a separate envelope, in case Pruitt wanted to see it. Friday arrived overcast with a cold wind from the northwest that smelled like rain 2 days out. Pruitt arrived at 9:30 in a wagon driven by a younger man she assumed was a grandson, who waited on the road while Pruitt climbed down with his equipment bag and walked toward Delia without hurrying. He was a compact man built with the economy of someone who had never carried unnecessary weight, either physical or conversational. He wore a heavy canvas work coat, oilcloth, treated against weather, and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a bag that clinked with instruments. He shook her hand once, firm, brief, businesslike, and looked past her toward the hill. "Show me." She walked him up. At the entrance, she pulled the door open and stepped aside. He went in without pausing, without asking questions, without any of the hesitation that most people showed at the threshold. Inside, he turned on his own lantern larger than hers with a polished reflector that cast a broad, flat light, and began working from the entrance wall toward the back. She stayed out of his way. She watched him work. He used a level on the walls at 3 heights, reading the bubble's position and recording the numbers without comment. He used a calibrated hammer, a short-handled instrument she didn't recognize, with a weighted head to tap the ceiling at regular intervals, listening to each tap with his head tilted slightly. He measured spans with his cloth tape, twice, once with her holding one end, once alone with a floor anchor. He crouched in each stall and looked at the drainage channel from the angle of its slope. When he reached the 3rd room, she followed him in. He went directly to the crack she'd marked in the logbook and held his lantern against it for a long time. Then he took a small folding rule from his bag and measured the crack's length-width at the widest point angle of departure from vertical. He pressed his thumbnail into the crack at its widest, looked at the thumbnail, wrote something. He came out of the 3rd room, walked back through the 2nd, through the 1st, out the entrance, sat down on the tailgate of his wagon, opened his bag, took out a fresh sheet of paper, wrote for approximately 8 minutes. Delia stood with her hands in her coat pockets. When he looked up, "The structure is sound." He said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis, not for comfort, but as information, better than sound in the main chamber. The arch is textbook batter construction. The walls incline inward as they rise, which transfers the load of the hillside downward rather than outward. Whoever designed that arch understood the physics. It's not intuitive work, it's considered work. He paused, looking at his notes. The ceiling beams in the 2nd room are hand-hewn oak, old growth from the density. They're set into pockets cut directly into the bedrock at the rear wall, not resting on ledger boards, not surface-mounted, seated in the rock. That's the critical detail. Those beams cannot shift laterally because the rock prevents it. Gas survived Tarsi. She asked about the cracks in the 3rd room. Old, stable. The diagonal crack at the low point is a shrinkage crack. It formed as the hill above settled over decades. It stopped propagating probably 15 to 20 years ago based on the fill pattern. He tapped his pen on the paper. Monitor it. If the width increases or the length extends, you'd want to look harder. As it stands, it's cosmetic. He looked at her directly. The 3rd room is the weakest of the 3, but weak here means marginally below excellent. It's still safer than most barns in this county. She asked how he knew the technique used for the arch. Ohio limestone country produced a particular tradition of underground construction in the 1840s and 1850s, farmers who couldn't afford above-grade buildings or who wanted something that wouldn't burn or who were thinking about long-term use rather than short. The technique for the arch, the batter wall, the corbelled crown, that specific combination I've seen in maybe a dozen structures in this state, all of them pre-war. He was quiet for a moment. Who built it? She took the envelope from inside her coat pocket and gave him Ezra's drawing. He unfolded it on the tailgate with the care she'd used on it the first time. He looked at it for a long while. When she looked at his face, something had shifted in it, a recalibration, small but visible, happening behind his eyes. He was still for too long, the way a man is still when he's processing something he wasn't prepared to encounter. His expression resettled. Ezra Hargrove. He folded the drawing along its creases and returned it to her. The construction is consistent with the date. The sophistication isn't typical for a solo farmer working without a crew, but it's not impossible. Some men simply have an understanding of how things sit together. He looked at the hillside. He designed it to outlast himself. He succeeded. She asked if it was safe to keep animals in the third room. Not until you shore up the ceiling supports at the low point. Add 2 posts, oak or elm, set on stone pads on the floor. That addresses the crack's potential trajectory if it ever resumes moving. After that, yes, safer than most. He put his instrument bag back in the wagon bed. I won't charge you for the visit. This is the most interesting thing I've looked at in 5 years. He climbed up to the seat without further ceremony. The man driving the wagon hadn't moved. He gave Delia a brief nod as they turned onto the road. She went back up to the hill. She stood in the third room with both lanterns, hers still burning, where she'd left it, casting double shadows on the cracked ceiling. She looked at the crack Pruitt had measured. She thought about what he'd said, stopped propagating 15 to 20 years ago. That meant the crack had formed between 1863 and 1868. The structure had been standing since 1861. The crack had come early in its life, had stabilized, had not moved since. The ceiling above her had been cracked for at least 15 years without consequence. She went to the main chamber, took 2 pieces of chalk from her coat pocket, marked the floor positions where she intended to place the support posts. Then she made a list in the logbook: posts, material, stone pad dimensions, sequence of work. She had sourced the oak posts by Monday, 2 lengths of salvaged timber from Obey Cutter's scrap pile, which Obey let her have for the cost of splitting a season's worth of kindling for his kitchen fire, a trade she completed in one afternoon with Henrik's Mall. She set the posts on Tuesday, cutting the stone pads herself from flat limestone she'd pulled from the section of wall that needed repair along the east fence line anyway. The posts seated cleanly, fitting between the floor and the ceiling with the tension of a well-fitted joint, adding their resistance to the stone above without drama. She stood back and looked at them. The low point of the third room's ceiling now had 2 oak columns rising to meet it, their grain running true, their bases solid on limestone pads. It looked like it had always been there. She had been keeping the 2 Berkshire pigs she'd bought from a man outside Millerton in the lean-to shed behind the house since their purchase 2 weeks prior in a temporary pen she'd built from scrap lumber and wire. The seller had been skeptical of her, the way certain older men are skeptical of young women with explicit livestock preferences, not hostile, but watchful, waiting for an error that would confirm his assumptions. She'd examined both animals carefully, checked their feet, their eyes, their mouths, their weight relative to their age. She'd bought them at his asking price without negotiating because the price was fair. With the third room's posts in place and Pruitt's specifications satisfied, she moved the pigs on Thursday. They had opinions about their transport from the shed to the hill, their unloading, their initial introduction to the entrance. They sniffed the opening for approximately 90 seconds, each taking in information through apparatus designed specifically for this kind of assessment. Then they walked in. She watched them move through the main chamber, through the second room into the third room, as though they were evaluating real estate. The dark-coated boar she'd named Flint investigated each corner in sequence, pressing his snout into the junctions of wall and floor, rooting slightly at the earth. The gilt she'd named Tallow went directly to the far wall, turned around once, lay down with the satisfaction of an animal that has found what it was looking for. Delia stood in the third-room doorway, looking at all of it. The goats in the main chamber, the hens roosting in the second room, the ducks near the drainage channel, the pigs settling in the third room. 26 animals in a structure built in 1861. The temperature in the third room read 54 degrees. The temperature outside was 41, dropping toward a forecast frost. Silas Brant stopped by the following morning. She was in the yard when she saw his wagon coming east on the road, slowing at her fence line. She walked out to meet him before he could come to the house. He sat on the wagon seat and looked at her. "Morning." His voice was exactly as even as it had been at their first meeting, carrying no information about what he thought of finding her in the yard rather than in the house. "I was passing." His gaze moved across the property with that particular quality of attention she'd noticed before, not casual, not conversational, measuring. She waited. "I've been hearing things," he said, "from people in town. You've got livestock somewhere on this property that nobody can account for." He looked at the empty pasture, the absent barn, the silent yards. "Marjorie Kern said she asked you directly, said you told her they were on the hill." "That's what I told her." His gaze moved to the hill. It moved slowly, methodically, starting from the left side of the slope and traveling right, stopping at the cedar scrub, moving on. She watched him watching the hill, and she tracked the movement of his eyes against her knowledge of what was there, waiting for the moment she'd noted before, that fractional pause at the section of the slope above the entrance. There it was, less than a second. His eyes rested on the section of hillside above the wild rose tangle, then moved on. "I don't see a structure," he said. "You wouldn't." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The exchange lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time for two people to hold eye contact without speaking. "Your grandfather was a stubborn man," Brant said finally. His tone carried no particular judgment, just the weight of long acquaintance with that stubbornness. "So I've been told." He picked up the reins. "Weather's turning tonight. If your animals are exposed, you'll lose them." He drove on. She went up to the hill immediately after he left. Not from anxiety, the animals were fine. She checked 2 hours ago, but because his visit had crystallized something she'd been circling for 2 weeks. She sat in the main chamber with Clover's warm flank against her knee, the lantern on its hook, the logbook open to the current page. She wrote the date April 8th, 1883. Then she wrote Brant, looked at the correct section of the slope twice. Not the road side of the hill, not the cedar ridge. The section above the entrance. Both times. She paused. Then he knows where to look. He does not know yet what he is looking for. These are different problems. 3 days later, Obadiah Cutter came by in the evening, which was unusual. Obie's social calls, such as they were, happened in the morning. He'd established this pattern over the many years he'd known Henrik, and it had not changed in Delia's experience. An evening visit meant something specific was being delivered. She poured him coffee at the kitchen table without being asked. He took it without thanks and sat for a moment looking at the cup. "I've been thinking about something I should have told you before," he said, "before you started whatever you're doing up on that hill." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Your grandfather knew about the structure. He'd been in it. He told me once, this was maybe 1871, 12 years ago, that he'd gone in to check it after the spring rains, make sure it hadn't taken water. He looked at the table. He said it was the finest piece of stonework he'd ever seen. Said his father had built something that would outlast everything else on the property." Delia set her own cup down. "He never told me." "No." Obey was quiet for a moment. "He chose not to use it. I asked him why once. He said some things are better left to the person who comes next." His fingers tightened on the cup. I didn't understand what he meant. Maybe he was thinking about you. Maybe he was thinking about something else. But I thought you should know that he knew. The kitchen was quiet. The wind had come up outside, pressing against the north wall. He left the drawing, Delia said, in the desk, under everything else. Obey nodded slowly. That sounds like Henrik. After Obey left, Delia sat at the table for a long time without moving. She thought about Henrik walking up the hill in 1871, opening the door, going inside, alone, coming back down, never rebuilding the barn that had burned 5 years later, never selling the land through all the lean years that followed, leaving the drawing in the bottom of the desk drawer, under the deed, under the will, where she would find it only after everything else was removed. He had left it as something to be found, not something to be given. She turned this over until it stopped feeling like an omission. She had $38 in the house at the end of April, which was more than she'd had in March, but less than she owed Hendricks by $44. She had 6 weeks before the account came due. The hens had started laying on day 9, in the hill 12 eggs, the first day climbing to 18 by the end of the second week. She was selling to 3 households in town and 1 to the cook at the Settlers Trust Bank, a detail she kept to herself because she thought it was funny. The ducks had begun laying on their own schedule, indifferent to hers, depositing eggs in the drainage channel corner at irregular hours. She factored them in anyway. The goat milk she sold to a woman named Frances Aldcott, who had 4 young children, a dairy intolerance, a practical nature, and cash. Frances came every Tuesday morning. She never asked where Delia kept the animals. Delia appreciated this. She had begun sleeping in the hill on the coldest nights, not because she needed to, but because she had started to understand that the space functioned differently from 11 at night until 4 in the morning than it did during the day, and she wanted to know what that difference was. The animals were calmer. The temperature was most stable. The ventilation shafts produced their quietest air movement in the hours before dawn, a circulation so gradual it was detectable only by holding a thread in the airstream. She lay on the canvas cot she'd brought down and read by lantern light and listened to the complete silence that is possible only underground where weather cannot reach. The night of June 14th began ordinary. The rain started at noon, which was not unusual for early summer in Ohio, a soft leading edge, the sky going gray from the west. By 3 in the afternoon, the character of the rain had shifted harder, more insistent, the kind of rain that is investing in the landscape rather than passing through it. Delia checked the sky at 5 and moved her evening task forward by an hour to ensure she had time to settle the animals before full dark. She was in the second room at 7, checking the hay supply on the racks, when the rain outside, which she could no longer hear but could infer from the quality of the air moving through the shafts, seemed to change register, a heaviness in the sound of nothing. Then the first sound from the third room, not a creak, not a groan, a crack sharp and dry the way a gun sounds in an enclosed space, a single report with a hard stop, then silence, then a low sustained grinding that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, followed by the unmistakable sound of mass in motion, stone and packed earth releasing downward in a controlled collapse. Delia was through the second room doorway before the noise stopped. The third room's ceiling, at the low point 12 inches to the left of the oak post she'd set in May, had released a section approximately 3 feet across. The stone had fallen directly onto the passage between the second room and the third, a section of floor she would have been walking on if she'd been 30 seconds ahead of her own schedule. The passage was blocked, solid, earth and limestone piled to within 2 feet of the ceiling. She stood at the edge of it with the lantern extended. The oak post she'd set was intact. Its section of ceiling was still there, the post doing its job. The crack she'd monitored was unchanged. What had given way was adjacent to it, in a section she hadn't marked as concerning, because Pruitt had marked the crack as the primary indicator. The primary indicator had been right. The ceiling adjacent to it had held a secondary stress she hadn't identified. She turned around. The pigs were awake on their feet, pressed against the far wall, both unhurt. She checked them by touch, running her hands across their backs, their legs. Sound. She went back through to the second room, hens unsettled, but roosted ducks close together near the pump. Back through to the main chamber, goats all standing watching her sable at the front, with her yellow eyes reflecting the lantern. 26 animals accounted for in 40 seconds, all present, all unhurt. The exit was blocked. She stood at the collapse point with the lantern and made an inventory. Approximately 6 cubic feet of material, mixed limestone rubble above packed earth below the earth component, being what had come through the ceiling gap after the stone gave way, pulled by gravity from the hillside above. The earth would be workable if it had enough time to drain. The limestone on top would require moving by hand. She looked at the lantern. The oil reservoir was 3/4 full when she'd filled it at 4 o'clock. At moderate burn, that gave her approximately 4 hours. She went back to the main chamber, sat down against the wall, with Clover's warmth pressed against her left side, set the lantern to its lowest useful setting, and waited. There was no point beginning before the water content in the passage earth had time to drain through the floor channels, which would make it loose enough to move. Working wet, compacted earth in the dark was a way to exhaust herself and make no progress. Working it in 2 hours, when the drainage had had time to act, was a different problem. She waited. She thought about the structure, about Pruitt's assessment, about the difference between the crack she'd monitored and the section that had actually moved. She thought about what she'd missed, not to punish herself, because that was not a useful activity at 11 o'clock in the dark underground, but because she needed to understand it. She'd missed it because she'd trusted the primary indicator too completely. Pruitt had pointed at the crack, and she'd watched the crack, and she hadn't given equal attention to the sections of ceiling that showed no visible sign of stress. In a natural formation, stress doesn't always announce itself before it moves. She would need to map the entire third room ceiling again after she got out. Closer attention, smaller grid. At approximately 2 in the morning, she got up, picked up the lantern, went to the blocked passage, set the lantern on the most stable piece of rubble, knelt on the floor, braced her boots against the base of the right wall, put both hands into the loose earth of the lower section, pulled the first armload toward her. The earth came freely, drained loose, manageable. She built a working rhythm, pull deposit to the right pull, again moving material from the blockage to the open floor of the third room, progressing toward the stone layer in the middle of the pile. The stone layer she cleared by hand as well, piece by piece, the smaller limestone rubble shifting aside with modest effort, the larger pieces requiring both hands a pivot, a controlled drop to the floor. She worked for 90 minutes. The gap opened at knee height first, then waist height, then she was through on her hands and knees in the second room passage with her cheek against the cool stone floor, breathing in the cleaner air of the lower level. She stood, checked the time by the lantern, nearly 4 in the morning, checked herself, hands lacerated across the palms, knuckles, a braided one thumbnail torn, clothing wet with earth. She went through the main chamber, through the entrance out into the night. The rain had stopped. The air outside was cold, washed clean, carrying the smell of standing water in the fields below. The sky was still dark, but beginning to differentiate at the east horizon, not light yet, but the suggestion of light's approach. She stood on the hillside and breathed. When her heartbeat had returned to something ordinary, she went back inside, made a complete circuit of all 3 rooms, accounted for every animal. For the second time, checked the posts. In the third room, checked the ceiling at the failure point. The stone gap was approximately 3 feet across as she'd measured it in the dark. Through it, she could see earth compacted above, but crumbling at the edges. There was no further movement. The sections adjacent to the gap were stable. She went home, washed her hands, made coffee, ate 2 pieces of bread, sat at the kitchen table with the logbook. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote, June 14th to 15th, 1883. Third room ceiling failure at non-monitored section, adjacent to cracked J block section, cleared by hand. 90 minutes. All animals confirmed uninjured. Exit restored approximately 4 a.m. She stopped, looked at the window. The sky was lightening in the east. She wrote one more line, ceiling assessment protocol inadequate, begin remap. Then in the margins, something she didn't usually write in the logbook, everything held that was supposed to hold. The animals were never in danger. The work was the problem, not the structure. She sent a letter to Pruitt that morning. He arrived on Thursday. She walked him through the collapse without preamble, showed him the failure point, showed him the post that had held. He stood in the third room for a long time, looking at the gap in the ceiling, then at the post, then at the ceiling on either side. You set the post at the right place, he said. The wrong thing moved. He moved his lantern across the ceiling in a slow arc. There's a seam here. Do you see it follows the bedding plane of the limestone? It's not a crack. It's a structural transition between 2 layers with different load characteristics. He tapped the ceiling at 2 points with his calibrated hammer. Listen to the difference. The crack I flagged was in the stable layer. This seam was in the layer above it. Different problem. He looked at her. You couldn't have seen this without knowing what you were looking for. Now I know. He assessed the ceiling fully. He identified the seam's extent, marked it with chalk on the stone, specified 3 additional post positions that would bridge the transition and redistribute the load of the hillside above. He wrote the specifications, post dimensions, stone pad sizes, spacing, and left the paper with her. She built it herself over the following 4 days. On the 4th day, when the last post was seated, she stood in the third room and looked at the ceiling. 5 posts, now including the original 2, following the chalk line Pruitt had marked. The room looked different, more deliberate, more considered. The natural irregularity of the space was now organized by the vertical lines of the supports, human geometry in conversation with the rock. She moved Flint back in that evening. Tallow had declined to relocate during the repair work, having established a preferred corner in the main chamber with apparent permanence, and was returned to the third room with the mild indignation of an animal whose preferences have been consulted too late. By the time Delia left for the night, both pigs were settled. The hens were roosted, the ducks were at the drainage channel, the goats were in their stalls. 26 animals, all accounted for. At the end of June, she received a second visit from Pruitt, unannounced this time, on a Tuesday afternoon. He drove up alone and found her in the yard, splitting the last of Obey's kindling trade. I told my wife about your setup, he said, climbing down from his wagon. She wanted to see it. I told her she'd have to ask you. Delia drove the maul through the last piece, set the 2 halves aside. Bring her. 3 days later, Ruth Pruitt walked into the main chamber of the hill, for the first time moved directly to the goat stalls, opened the first gate, went in, crouched down. She was 64 years old, had raised dairy goats in Knox County for 3 decades, and she brought to animal assessment the same unhurried precision her husband brought to stone. She spent 40 minutes with the 3 goats, checking every surface that could be checked: hooves, trimmed, eyes clear, coats dense without the dry brittleness that signals nutritional deficiency. She looked at the milking record in the logbook. She asked about mineral supplementation, about the grazing schedule, about the lice check protocol. Delia answered each question with the fact it required. When Ruth came out of the stall, she straightened up and looked at Delia with the appraising directness of someone who has spent 60 years deciding what is worth her respect. You know what you're doing, she said, not wondering, not conceding, simply stating what the evidence had shown her. It was the first time anyone had said it plainly. Delia didn't thank her for it. It wasn't the kind of thing that required thanks. Word began moving through the county in the particular way that farming news moves, not through announcement, but through revision. The story of the girl on Dry Creek Road who had livestock but no barn became slowly a different story. People stopped asking where the animals were. They started asking with a different quality of curiosity what was happening up there. Frances Aldcott mentioned it to the woman at the next farm. The woman at the next farm mentioned it to someone at the feed co-op. The co-op mentioned it to Hendricks. Thomas Hendricks, to his credit, said nothing except that the Hargrove account was current. In August, when the temperature outside had been above 85 for 11 consecutive days, Delia walked up to the hill at midday and recorded the temperature inside 58 degrees. She wrote it down, then wrote it again in larger figures on a separate line because the precision of the number seemed worth emphasizing. By then, she had built a small temporary coop from salvaged lumber near the east corner of the house overflow housing for 6 additional hens she'd acquired from a farm sale in late July when an elderly neighbor was dispersing her flock. She also had 2 lambs she'd purchased as an experiment from a wool producer in the eastern part of the county, along with 4 additional Toggenburg, that Linda Marsh had contacted her about in a letter that said only, "I have 4 more if you want them. Finest I've raised, I think your place suits them." She'd bought all 4. That brought the total to 31 animals, the original 3 goats plus 4, Newdo's the 2 Berkshire pigs, the original 18 hens plus 3 more from the July sale, 3 ducks and the 2 lambs. The 6 overflow hens occupied the temporary coop near the house and would come down into the hill proper before winter when the second room could be reorganized to accommodate them. The lambs were the most recent addition, 2 weeks old, still requiring supplemental feeding. She sat with them in the main chamber on a wooden stool at 8 in the morning, a bottle in each hand, watching their vigorous objection to the pace at which milk was being delivered. They were gaining weight at the rate the book specified. The hill temperature was exactly what sheep preferred. The humidity was what their respiratory systems required. She thought, sitting there in the cool and the quiet, about what Aldrich Fenn had said in March, "You have no collateral." She thought about what Silas Brandt had said, $800 cash. She thought about the road outside where people who had seen only an empty pasture had formed a story about a young woman failing at something she'd announced publicly by buying animals with nowhere to put them. She was not failing. She was also not done. The accounts at Hendricks were current. She had $48 liquid. She had 31 animals in good health with 0 mortality since March. She had a structure that had passed through a ceiling failure and a 90-minute repair and was now more thoroughly documented than any barn in the county. She looked at the lambs pulling at the bottles in her hands. She thought, by winter, I'll know if this works. The thought settled into the back of her mind the way certainties settle, not with drama, just with weight. September arrived in Licking County the way it always did, without asking permission, pulling the heat out of the air in a single week, turning the light from white to gold. Delia noticed it first in the hill where the temperature dropped 2 degrees between the 1st of September and the 15th, settling at 56 in the main chamber, 54 in the 3rd room. She recorded this in the logbook with the same notational brevity she used for everything date room reading. Deviation from previous week. The animals noticed it differently. The goats grew fractionally more active in the cooler air, moving through their stalls with an energy they hadn't shown in August's peak. The hens increased their laying by 3 eggs per day over the same 2-week span. Small signals but consistent. The hill was shifting into its winter configuration, and the animals were responding to it the way animals respond to conditions that suit them by thriving. The fair came to Newark on the 14th of September, the annual agricultural exhibition that drew every working farmer within 20 miles. Delia had attended it every year of her conscious life first with Henrik, then as his representative, when his legs wouldn't carry him the distance, then alone. She knew its rhythms, the livestock judging. In the morning, the equipment exhibitions at midday, the informal gathering in the covered pavilion through the afternoon, where the community's actual business got conducted, in the margins of conversations about crops. She went on Friday, the first full day, with her logbook in her coat pocket, because she had taken to carrying it everywhere, the way some people carry a Bible. She was at the cattle judging when she saw Silas Brandt across the ring. He was standing with two other men she recognized, members of the county agricultural board, both older, both with the settled authority of people whose opinions had been solicited for decades. Brandt was talking. The other two were listening. All three of them were looking at intervals in her direction. She watched them watching her for approximately 30 seconds. Then she turned back to the cattle in the ring. The conversation came 2 hours later in the covered pavilion where the afternoon crowd had thinned to the people who had something specific to say to someone specific. Brandt approached from her left while she was looking at a seed display, his footsteps deliberate on the pavilion boards, with enough advance notice that she could have moved away if she'd chosen to. She stayed where she was. Miss Hargrove. He positioned himself at her elbow slightly too close for the distance between two people with no prior warmth. I've been hearing more about your situation from people in town. He kept his voice at a register that carried no further than the two of them. There's some concern being expressed about the status of your livestock housing, specifically whether it meets the standards the county requires for commercial animal keeping. She looked at him fully. His face was composed, carrying an expression of civic concern so practiced it had become structurally integrated the way habits become posture over time. I'm not running a commercial operation. You're selling eggs to multiple households. You're selling milk on a recurring basis. Under county ordinance, that qualifies as commercial. He let this sit for a moment. The concern is that if your animals are being kept in substandard or unverified conditions, there's a public health dimension. Contaminated milk, disease, poultry. These things spread. The two board members were visible across the pavilion, not looking at her now, but present. She understood the architecture of what was happening, the conversation being conducted in a place where it could be observed, the civic framing, the reference to ordinance, rather than preference. Brandt had prepared this. He had prepared it carefully. She took a slow breath, not from anxiety, from the discipline of choosing the right words from among the many available. The structure housing my animals was assessed in April by August Pruitt, a licensed civil engineer with 40 years of practice in Ohio. He found it to be sounder than 90% of barns in this county. I have his written assessment. She paused. I also have records of every animal. I'm keeping their health status, their feed, their water source. My records go back to March. She looked at the two board members across the pavilion, then back at Brandt. If the county wants to conduct an inspection, I welcome it. I would like them to bring someone who understands masonry and load-bearing stone. Brandt's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. Something behind it recalculated. That's a reasonable position, he said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had not gotten what he came for but was not prepared to acknowledge this openly. Mr. Brandt, she kept her voice even, matching his register, you've offered to buy my land 3 times. You've known my name since before we were introduced. You've looked at my hillside every time you've come to my property. She watched his face. I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm telling you that I've noticed. Whatever your interest is in that property, it doesn't change what I'm doing with it. She picked up the seed catalog she'd set down when he arrived. I hope your cattle do well in the judging. Ya tabi. She walked away from him at a pace that communicated no hurry. Obey Cutter found her near the wagon yard 20 minutes later. He must have been watching, or he'd been told, because he arrived at her shoulder with the purposeful quiet of someone who has a specific thing to say. I saw you talking to Brandt, he said. He raised the county ordinance question. Obey was silent for a moment. He mentioned it to me last week, asked if I thought there was a case. He didn't look at her while he said this, looked at the wagon yard instead. I told him I didn't know enough about the situation to have an opinion. A pause. That was before I thought it through. He finally looked at her. I'll go to Fen at the bank if it helps. Tell him you're running a legitimate operation. My word carries some weight there. She had not expected this. She absorbed it without showing that. It would help. He nodded once the way men of his generation nod when they've done the thing they came to do. He walked back toward the cattle ring without further conversation. She drove home that evening with the logbook on the seat beside her, Porter picking his footing in the gathering dusk, the sky over the hill turning the particular color of autumn dark, not the blue-black of summer nights, but a deeper, more considered darkness. She had what she needed. She had it in writing, in records, in the structure itself. Whatever Brant had intended with the conversation at the fair, she had met it with evidence rather than argument, which meant the next move was his, not hers. The next move came 3 days later. She was in the yard repairing the east fence line when she saw his wagon coming west on the road. He slowed, pulled off the track, climbed down. This time he came alone with none of the previous visits' quality of transactional purpose. He walked to the fence line where she was working, put his hand on the top rail, looked at the hill. He stood there for a moment without speaking. I owe you a direct conversation, he said finally. His voice had a different quality than it had carried at the fair, not softer exactly, but stripped of the civic performance. Something underneath the practice tone, something that had been there a long time. She set down the wire stretcher. She waited. My father's name was Conrad Brant. He kept his eyes on the hill while he talked. He came to this county in 1851. He took the land to the west of yours by claim the year before your great-grandfather arrived. He paused. When Ezra Hargrove started building in that hill, this was 1858, 1859. My father watched him work. Conrad understood what Ezra was doing. He'd seen hill shelters in the hill country further east, knew what they were for. He was quiet for a moment. He went to Ezra and asked if they could work together, share the structure, share the cost. Ezra said no, didn't give reasons, just no. His hand tightened slightly on the fence rail. My father spent the rest of his life believing that structure should have been shared. He told me about it when I was young, the way you tell a child about an injustice. You want them to remember. Delia said nothing. She was watching his face now, tracking the difference between the man who had offered her $800 without asking the acreage and this man who was giving her something she hadn't asked for. I inherited the belief along with the land, Brant continued. I thought if I owned the property, I'd have what my father was denied. I didn't think through what that meant about the person already living there. He looked at her for the first time since he'd started talking. I knew your grandfather. Henrik was a fair man. I let myself believe the land mattered more than the person because it was easier. He took his hand off the fence rail. It was the wrong way to think about it. I've known that for a while. I needed to say it out loud. The air between them was still. A crow called once from the cedar ridge above the hill, then was quiet. Ezra Hargrove built that structure alone, she said. 3 years, every stone by hand. Whatever your father wanted from that hill, he didn't earn any part of it. She held the next sentence until she was sure of it. But you didn't build what your father built, so you don't carry what he owed. You carry what you've done yourself. She picked up the wire stretcher. You can think about whether that changes things. Brant stood there another moment. Then he put his hat back on, turned, walked to his wagon. He climbed up, took the reins, drove west. He did not look back. She went back to the fence repair. She worked for another hour until the east line was tight. From the road to the creek bend, every post solid, every wire tensioned. Then she walked up to the hill, went inside, moved through the main chamber in the easy, unhurried way she developed over the months of daily entry, not inspecting, just present. Clover was at the water trough. Jasper was lying in his stall with the philosophical composure he brought to every situation. Sable was standing on the stone ledge at the back of the main chamber, the shelf Ezra had built into the wall, at the height of a goat's curiosity. She had claimed it in April and had made it hers with the unhesitating conviction of an animal that recognizes a surface built for its specific occupation. Delia sat down on the wooden stool she'd brought down in June. The temperature on the thermometer read 56 degrees. Outside it was 44 falling. She wrote this in the logbook. Then she sat for a while without writing anything, listening to the faint draw of the ventilation shafts, the small sounds of animals at rest, the silence that lives under all of it. October moved through the county with efficiency. The harvest sales began in the first week, filling the roads with wagons and the air with the smell of cut corn. Delia sold the first litter of pig offspring Flint had fathered, 4, all healthy, 2 of which she sold to a farm family in the southern part of the county at a price that cleared her remaining debt to Hendricks with $11 remaining. She noted this in the logbook with no special emphasis. It was a fact like any other fact. The account was current. She was operating without debt for the first time since March. Ruth Pruitt came back in October this time, without August, for reasons she stated simply. She wanted to see the second-generation lambs. Delia walked her through the main chamber into the second room where the lambs had been moved as they grew out to the expanded pen she'd built along the east wall of the second room using materials salvaged from the collapsed coop. Ruth crouched beside the lambs, ran her hands over their backs, checked their eyes with the practiced certainty of someone who has made this exact assessment 10,000 times. "They're correct," Ruth said, which was the highest assessment she offered. It meant the animal matched what it was supposed to be in weight, in condition, in temperament. "Your feed ratios are right. Most people overfeed early lambs." The books Henrik kept were specific about early lambs. Ruth looked at her over the backs of the two animals. "Books tell you what to do. Experience tells you when not to do what the book says." She stood. "You're building experience fast." She said this without sentiment as a measurement. "By your second winter, you'll know things that take most farmers 5 years to learn." Delia thought about this on the walk back down to the house after Ruth left. She had been thinking about the second winter since August, when the logbook's entries had begun to accumulate enough data to project forward. She had 31 animals going into autumn 35. Once she brought the 6 overflow hens from the temporary coop into the reorganized second room before the hard freeze came. She needed sufficient hay stores for 6 months of reduced grazing. She had calculated this 3 times, using different estimation methods, arriving at the same number each time. She had the hay. The second room storage racks held more than she'd projected when she'd built them out. She needed one more thing before winter, and she'd been putting it off because it required a conversation she wasn't sure she wanted to have. She drove to August Pruitt's property in Knox County on a Wednesday morning in late October, unannounced, arriving at 10. His wife Ruth was in the yard and pointed her toward the barn without surprise, as though Delia's arrival had been expected or simply fit into a category of thing that happened regularly. Pruitt was inside working on a feed mechanism, looked up when she came in, set down his tools. She told him what she wanted: a second structural assessment, full documentation, a written statement she could present to the county agricultural board if Brandt's ordinance challenge progressed to a formal complaint. She wanted it to be unambiguous. She wanted it to be the kind of document that answered questions before they were asked. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. "You're not asking for my opinion on whether to fight it?" "No." "Good." He picked up his tools again. "I'll come the second Friday of November. I'll bring a full kit. Give me the whole day." She drove back to Licking County with the wagon window open. Despite the cold, the air coming in off the corn stubble fields carrying the particular smell of late October in Ohio turned earth-decaying leaves, the distant edge of wood smoke from someone burning brush in a backfield. She was thinking about the conversation with Brant, about what he'd said. I let myself believe the land mattered more than the person because it was easier. She turned the sentence over, examining it. Not because it changed anything, because it was the kind of sentence that deserved to be understood rather than simply filed. November came in cold. The first hard frost arrived on the 3rd, locking the mud in the lane into rigid corrugations that rattled the wagon axles and turned the standing water in the low corner of the east pasture to a gray skin of ice overnight. Delia walked the perimeter of the property on the 4th, noting freeze penetration at each fence post, checking the well pump housing she'd wrapped in burlap in October. Everything held. She went up to the hill and recorded the temperature. 52 degrees in the main chamber, 50 degrees in the 3rd room. The frost above the hill had dropped the ambient stone temperature 2 degrees. Within the week, it would stabilize the mass of limestone above, acting as a thermal reservoir that changed slowly and returned to equilibrium slowly. She brought the 6 overflow hens down from the temporary coop near the house during the first week of November, consolidating them into the reorganized 2nd room alongside the original flock. The temporary co-op she dismantled and stored the lumber behind the shed. The hill now held 35 animals, 7 Toggenburg does, the Weather Jasper, 2 Berkshire pigs, 24 hens, 3 ducks, and 2 young sheep. She wrote this in the logbook: 35, all in good health, all eating, all drinking, none showing the lethargy that precedes winter, decline in animals that are cold or stressed. Pruitt came on the 2nd Friday of November, as promised, with a younger man she didn't recognize, who turned out to be a structural draftsman Pruitt used for professional documentation work. They spent 6 hours inside the hill. The draftsman produced scaled drawings of all 3 rooms, cross-referenced to Pruitt's measurements with the post positions marked, the ventilation shaft angles, noted the drainage channel grades specified. Pruitt wrote his assessment in the draftsman's presence, signed it, had it witnessed. He handed Delia 2 copies. She read it, standing at the hill entrance in the November cold. The subject structure is a 3-chamber underground livestock facility constructed in limestone bedrock, estimated date 1858 to 1861, located on the Hargrove property, Licking County, Ohio. Construction method is dry stack batter masonry with corbelled arch ceiling in the primary chamber, supported timber framing in the secondary chamber, and modified natural formation in the tertiary chamber. The structure has been assessed on 2 occasions, April and November 1883, and found to be structurally sound for the housing of livestock in all 3 chambers. Temperature, ventilation, drainage, and water supply are adequate by any reasonable standard of agricultural practice. This structure is safer than the majority of above-grade farm buildings I have assessed in 40 years of professional practice. She folded the document, put it in the leather folder that now held Ezra's drawing, the deed, the will, the business plan. Fenn had dismissed the growing record of what the hill had become. Pruitt watched her put the folder away. If Brant files a formal complaint, present that to the board before he gets through his first sentence. He was quiet for a moment. He won't file. I think he already knows the answer to the question he was asking. He climbed into the wagon. The draftsman was already seated, his drawings rolled and cased. She stood at the lane entrance and watched them drive north. Brant never filed. December arrived, bringing the cold that settles into Ohio hill country in earnest, not the tentative chill of November, but the committed cold of a season that has decided to stay. The temperature outside dropped to 18 degrees on the 14th of December, recovered briefly, dropped again. The creek froze between the 14th and the 21st, the surface forming overnight and thickening with each subsequent night until it would bear weight. Delia tested it with the fence post on the 22nd, pressing down with her full weight at the end of the post solid. The hill temperature dropped to 48 degrees in the main chamber. The third room read 46. She recorded these numbers with particular attention because she had been waiting to see how far the temperature would go in a genuinely cold December, with hard frost penetrating the ground above and the air outside maintaining a sustained freeze. 48 degrees in the main chamber when it was 18 outside. The differential was 30 degrees. The limestone above was doing its work. The animals were unchanged by the cold outside. The goats' coats had thickened in the natural way of goats moving into winter, responding to the lengthening nights and the shortened grazing periods, but their appetite was steady, their water consumption normal, their behavior unbothered. The hens continued laying through December, not at their peak rate, but consistently, which was unusual for above-grade housing where lighting was limited. The hill's interior, lit by lantern during Delia's morning checks, provided enough light stimulus to maintain the hen's cycle. She noted this in the logbook with the observation that it might be worth investigating as a formal question in the spring. The lambs had become sheep by December, not mature but substantive, their summer tentative quality replaced by the denser presence of animals that had found their form. She'd named them in September against her own earlier practice of keeping the animals at a working distance in her notation. The male was Flint's son in temperament, if not in species, deliberate, watchful, prone to blocking doorways, and seeming unaware of it. She called him Cleet. The female was Clover's particular favorite among all the animals in the hill, a fact Delia had noted without being able to explain, since the two species had no functional relationship. She called her Wren. On the evening of January 6, 1884, the sky changed. She felt it before she saw it. The air pressure dropped in the way that old farmers describe as the sky leaning a heaviness that presses down on the sinuses. She was in the kitchen when it began cooking the evening meal, and she stood still for a moment with the spoon in her hand and looked at the north window. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy and low, moving fast from the northwest. She set the spoon down, put on her coat, walked outside. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since noon. The wind had shifted from its usual westerly to due north, carrying the smell that every Ohio farmer knows, the particular cold damp of a storm drawing moisture from the Great Lakes, combined with the dry bite of air that has crossed frozen ground for a long distance. She stood in the yard for 2 minutes reading the sky. She went back inside, ate standing at the counter, packed a bag, blankets, the canteen food for 2 days, the logbook, extra lantern oil, carried it up to the hill, settled the animals with their full evening feed rather than the smaller ration she gave when she knew she'd be back in the morning, filled every water trough to its maximum capacity. Then she went back to the house, banked the kitchen stove, secured the doors, returned to the hill, went inside, pulled the entrance door closed behind her. The sound of the outside world disappeared. She'd experienced this quality of the hill's acoustic isolation before, but it was different when the weather was active above. From outside, even from 100 feet away, you could hear nothing of what was happening in the main chamber. From inside, even with a storm building above the ridge, you could hear nothing of what was happening outside. The limestone was perfectly indifferent to the drama on its surface. She laid her bedding on the cot, lit the secondary lantern, set the primary to its lowest useful burn. The temperature read 52 degrees. She checked each stall, each roost, the duck corner, the pig section in the third room. Everything ordinary, everything calm. Clover was lying down. Jasper was eating with the methodical pace of a goat that treats every meal as a serious undertaking. Delia sat on the stool, opened the logbook to a fresh page, wrote the date, the temperature, the animal count, the conditions she'd observed outside. Storm incoming, all animals secured, supplies for 2 days, temperature in main chamber 52 degrees, temperature outside falling approximately 12 degrees at time of entry, wind north at significant strength. She put the pen down. She could not hear the storm. She could not feel it. Above her, 30 feet of limestone was receiving it fully, the wind loading the hillside, the temperature dropping against the rock, the snow beginning to fall and accumulate on the surface above the ventilation shafts. None of this reached her. The air through the shafts moved at its steady, untroubled pace, neither warmer nor colder than it had been an hour ago. She wrapped herself in the blanket, leaned against the wall, listened to the animals breathing. She thought about Ezra Hargrove, who had built this place in 1858, knowing what Ohio winters were, who had cut the ventilation shafts at angles that would prevent snow accumulation from blocking the airflow, who had positioned the entrance on the southeast face of the hill rather than the north or west where prevailing storm winds arrived, who had thought about where the drainage channel's exit point would be relative to the prevailing slope so that it would not freeze and back up. None of this was in the drawing he'd left. The drawing showed what he'd built. The thinking behind it was legible only in the fact that it worked. She slept. She woke at 3 in the morning to the unaltered silence of the hill. The temperature read 52. She added oil to the primary lantern, checked the animals, went back to the cot, slept again until first light, which she measured not by any window, but by her own body clock, which had learned the hill's rhythm over months. She packed her bag at 5 in the morning, pulled on her coat, lifted the entrance door's interior bar. She pushed. The door did not move. She put her shoulder against it, pushed harder. It moved 2 inches and stopped, pressed against resistance from the outside. Snow. She had known this was possible, had chosen the southeast face partly to reduce the risk, but a large enough storm overcame the geometry. She went back inside, retrieved the short-handled shovel she'd added to the hill's equipment cache in November after the ceiling collapse had taught her to anticipate exit problems. She worked the blade through the 6-inch gap in the door, pushing snow outward, clearing a working space, enlarging the gap by inches. 20 minutes. The door swung open. She stood in the entrance and looked at what the night had done. The snow was 3 feet deep on the flat ground below the hill, deeper in the drifts along the fence lines, running in smooth, unbroken curves over every surface that had been irregular the day before. The sky was clear, the color of thin glass, the sun not yet above the ridge, but its light already filling the valley in that flat, diffused way that follows storms. The air was cold enough to feel against her face from inside the entrance passage. She checked the thermometer she'd hung just outside the door, negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Below the yard, the road. Beyond the road, the fields. She could see 3 neighboring properties from this elevation, the Cutter place to the east, the farms further west that she didn't know by name, a set of roof lines visible through the bare trees south of the road. From the Cutter place, no sound from the cattle barn. The absence of sound that should have been there, the morning low of cattle, ready to be fed, was itself sound. From the Brandt property further west, a plume of dark smoke thin, rising from a point that was not a chimney. The wrong color, the wrong location. She went down the slope on the path she'd packed over months of daily use, which even under 3 feet of new snow held its form enough to navigate. She crossed the yard, went to the fence line along the road. The Cutter barn was visible from there. The doors were closed. Nothing moved. She went to Obey Cutter's house first because it was closer. She knocked. Obey opened the door after a long pause, and she saw immediately what she'd heard. In the silence, his face had the compressed, set expression of a man containing a loss he has not yet fully admitted to himself. He looked past her toward his barn. 3 cattle, he said, frozen overnight. The others made it. He focused on her face. Yours? She said 35. All 35. She watched his face absorb this. He looked at the hill above her house, then back at her. He had known since the fall in the general way. The county had come to know that she was keeping animals in the hill. He had not until this moment understood what that meant in specific terms. 35, he said again in the tone people use when a number means more than the number. She nodded once. I'm going to check on the road. She went back to her house hitched. Porter drove east along the road at a pace careful of the drifted sections. 3 farms, she checked. 2 had losses, 1 significant, a barn wall that had partially collapsed under snow load, taking 4 animals, 1 minor, 2 older sheep that hadn't been brought inside early enough. The 3rd farm's animals had survived in a stone outbuilding solid enough to hold. She drove back west past her own property, continued to the Brant place. The dark smoke had resolved into its source, a secondary shed along the north edge of Brant's yard, a small frame structure that had caught fire from an overloaded stove put out before it spread, but the shed was a loss. Brant's main cattle barn, a large timber frame structure on the west side of his property, had lost its east hay storage addition to the snow load. The cattle in the main section had survived. The hay loss was significant. Brant was in the yard when she arrived, surveying the damage with 2 farmhands. He saw her coming and walked to the fence line. He looked at her with the direct, factual expression he carried when there was no pretense available. Your animals, he asked, all accounted for. She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask her to. She looked at the collapsed addition, the scorched shed wall. You have enough hay for the rest of winter. He was quiet for a moment. Short. 20% short, maybe. Depends on how long this cold holds. He paused. I have stores on the east property I can move. It'll cost time. If you need it before you can move it, I have surplus in storage. She said this without framing it, as generosity stated it, the way she stated temperatures and feed ratios, a fact offered for use. I overstored for the first winter. Precaution. Brant looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not a dramatic movement, just the slight change of a man recalibrating the distance between what he had expected from someone and what they had just done. I'll let you know, he said. It was not effusive. It was not required to be. She drove back to her property. Porter was tired from the deep snow, moving carefully, his breath coming in steady clouds. She unhitched him at the lean-to, forked his hay, gave him extra water. She walked up to the hill, went inside, stood in the main chamber in the 52-degree air, with her coat still on. She had offered Brant hay. She turned this over for a moment, not to examine whether it was right as a plain fact of neighboring. She was examining what it meant that she had offered it without thinking about it first, without calculation. The man had spent months applying pressure to her livelihood, had used civic mechanisms to challenge her right to operate, had known about her family's property for decades, through a story of grievance his father had passed down. She had offered him hay. She thought some inheritances are worth keeping and some are worth setting down, and neither Brant nor I invented the ones we were given. She wrote this in the logbook, not as a lesson, not as a conclusion, as a thing that had become clear on a cold morning in January, after a night spent underground while the weather moved across the surface of everything without touching what she had built beneath it. August Pruitt came by the second week of January, unannounced, which was becoming his pattern. He came in the mornings now, stayed an hour, drank the coffee she made, looked at the logbook entries she'd accumulated since his last visit. He didn't explain these visits, and she didn't ask him to. He was retired. He had an interest in the work. These were sufficient reasons. He arrived on the 12th, and she poured his coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and read through the logbook entries from December and January without speaking. When he was done, he set it down and looked at the window. I've been talking to some people, he said, at the State Agricultural Board about what you've done here. He wrapped both hands around the cup. There's interest in documenting it formally, not as a case study, that's the wrong word, as a record, what the structure is, how it functions, what the temperature differential is across seasons, what the animal outcomes have been. He looked at her. There's a professor of agriculture at Ohio State College who studies farm infrastructure. He's been looking for examples of pre-industrial underground livestock housing, that are still operational. He paused. You'd be under no obligation. Your methods and your records would be yours. They'd only use what you agreed to share. Allow me. She looked at the logbook on the table. 11 months of daily entries, temperature readings, feed records, animal weights, health observations, incident reports. Tell me what they'd want, she said. Pruitt told her. It was less than she'd expected. A site visit, a review of the logbook, a written description of the structure, with Pruitt's engineering documentation already prepared, a conversation with the professor about what she'd observed over the operational period, her name on the record. Give me a week, she said. She spent the week working because work clarified things in a way that deliberation often did not. She checked the animals twice daily in the cold, expanded the hay storage allocation in the second room to give herself an additional season's buffer, repaired a section of the main chamber's eastern partition that had developed a minor sag at one post. She wrote in the logbook. She sold eggs on Tuesday. She talked to Frances Alcott, who had renewed her goat milk order for the spring season, and asked if Delia planned to add sheep's milk to her products. She thought about Henrik sitting at his desk in the years after the barn burned, leaving the property in deliberate rest rather than managed decline, leaving the drawing in the bottom of the drawer, leaving the decision to someone who hadn't yet arrived. The patience required for that kind of waiting was not a passive thing. It was its own form of construction. On the last day of the week, she walked up to the hill at noon. She went up and stood in the main chamber for a few minutes in the lantern light. 50 degrees, calm. The animals at their midday quiet. Clover lying down, Jasper engaged in the considered evaluation of the hay he'd already been eating for an hour. Wren pressed against the pen partition, watching the goats with the alert patience of a young animal that is still learning what the world is made of. She looked at the vaulted ceiling above the center of the room, the arch that Ezra had built with the inward lean that transferred every pound of the hill's weight downward rather than outward. She thought about what Pruitt had said in April, considered work not intuitive work, someone who understood what they were doing before they began, who built toward a result they could see before the stone was in place. She had not understood what she was doing before she began. She had found the door, gone inside, come back out, looked at the drawing, gone back in. She had learned what the structure was by living inside the work of building something in it. These were different kinds of knowing, Ezra's kind and her kind, but they were not opposites. They were what you needed at different stages of the same problem. She went back down to the house, wrote a one-paragraph reply to Pruitt, left it with the outgoing mail for Thomas Hendricks to collect when he came by with the February supply order. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the logbook open to a blank page and added the entry for the day. January 19th, 1884, main chamber 50 degrees, all animals present, all in good health. No incidents. Logbook entry count since March 21st, 1883, 304. She looked at that number for a moment. 304 consecutive days of records, starting from the evening she'd brought 3 goats up the slope and watched them settle in a lit stone room that nobody else knew existed. 35 animals now, not 3. The third room operational. The second room storing 2 seasons of hay. The ventilation shafts moving air through stone the way they had moved air through stone since 1861, indifferent to the seasons above them. She closed the logbook, capped the pen, carried her coffee cup to the sink. Through the north window, she could see the hill, its surface carrying the last of the January snow in the hollows where the sun hadn't reached. The entrance was invisible from the house, which was exactly how Ezra had intended it. Nothing from the road, nothing from the yard, nothing from a neighbor's fence line. Just the hill holding its shape, holding its temperature, holding everything inside it with the patient permanence of stone that has had a long time to decide what it is. She put on her coat, picked up the logbook, went out through the back door into the cold afternoon, and walked up the path toward the hill, her boots finding the packed track below the new snow, the way they found it every morning, easy, certain, worn into a groove by 300 days of the same walk, the path itself, now a record of how many times she had made this choice without it being a choice at all, just the next thing, the necessary thing, the work.